Welcome to ARMA International's webinar, Breaking It Down, Best Practices for Simplifying Your Records Retention Schedule. I'm Ann Snyder, your guest moderator for today's session. This is my first civilian session. Today's webinar is sponsored by the great folks at Zazio Enterprises. For those of you who have attained your IGP, the Information Governance Professional Certification, today's webinar counts toward 1 continuing education credit. So today's webinar is actually building on a webinar that we did with Zazio in December of last year. That was Get Your Records Retention Schedule Under Control and Keep It That Way. And in that webinar, we walked through a step-by-step process used to assess the current state of your records retention schedule and how to build out a roadmap to close any gaps that you identified in that schedule. If you haven't seen that, I suggest you go back and check that out on the ARMA website, and hopefully we can include a link to that directly in the email. That's a follow-up to this one. So we'll start quickly with some just quick introductions to the subject matter experts who are on our panel today from Zazio, and then we're going to dig right into some actual examples. So this is going to be actual words on a page, not abstractions. So it's part, it's going to have a little bit of, I think, of a workshop feel. Our SMEs from Zazio and I are going to walk you through the examples. We'll identify what we see, where there are opportunities for consolidation and simplification, and considerations that you should weigh in the process of that simplification. And then we'll take a look at what that modified retention schedule looks like. And we're going to take a look at some common examples of vertical and horizontal sprawl in record series. We'll discuss optimizing bucket size to match your organization's risk appetite. We'll talk about carving out exceptions where required, considerations in the wording of the new record series, simplification of the use of triggers, harmonizing global schedules, how technology can help. At a couple points, Warren's going to come in and show us the VR tool, and much more. So then we'll open it up to a Q&A at the end. But let's get started quickly with some introductions to our panelists. We're excited to welcome back Jen and Warren, and now we're joined by Rick. So if you guys can just say a few words about yourselves.
Sure. I'll start. Thank you, Anne. Hi, Jennifer Chadband here, senior analyst, licensed attorney with Zazio. I've been with Zazio for nearly 10 years. I am really enjoying seeing all of the messages in the chat, and hellos from all over the world. I'm seeing Hungary, I'm seeing Canada, I'm seeing California, Colorado, Iceland. Shout out from the Zazio headquarters here in Boise, Idaho, proud members of the Mountain Time Zone. Thanks for joining, everybody.
I'll go next. My name is Rick Serber. I'm also a senior analyst at Zazio. I co-manage the consulting division with Jen, and I also manage the research division. And I've been with Zazio for nearly 12 years now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Warren Bean, and I am not an analyst nor an attorney, and I don't play one on TV. I am, as you can see there, the senior sales engineer. I also head up the management of the developers and sort of lead the product development cycle here at Zazio. So I'll be talking about the technical aspects of the retention schedule management process. And I've got you all beat. I'll be here for 21 years as of this July.
Wow.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much. This is a really great panel that you've assembled for us, Zazio. Thank you so much. So let's just start digging right into this. We have a lot to cover today. So we're going to look at some common examples. A common problem we've discussed a couple times in the previous webinar was about sprawl of record series. Now, I understand there can be both vertical and horizontal sprawl, and each of those types of sprawl in series offers an opportunity for consolidation. But before we get into our first example here, which is vertical sprawl, can you tell us a little bit about what we mean by those two things, and what are some common examples that you see out there in the wild?
Yeah, absolutely. I can take that one, Anne. And don't get too caught up in the designation of vertical versus horizontal, because I think people think of it or term it differently. Mm-hmm. But essentially, what we're terming as vertical sprawl, which we'll give an example of first, is sprawl that relates to processes that cross departmental lines. Mm-hmm. So conceptually, we're considering similar records found in multiple departments. I think some good examples of that would be something like employee expense reports, annual employee reviews, contracts, and then procedures. You can see here as our first example. But these are things that multiple departments may have and may very well have their own terminology for, that we can look to consolidate through various functions into one. Whereas the second type of sprawl, horizontal sprawl, would be consolidation within a function itself or a department itself. So multiple related categories that can be consolidated into one category with processes within one department or function.
Okay, so in this first example here, so we're calling this one vertical sprawl. This is the collapsing across functions. What do we see here? Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so just to kind of set it up, and we'll follow a similar format, so I'll only have to really explain this basic part of it once. On the far left, we've got the departments or functions, IT, corporate government, governance, HR. There's even some industry-specific stuff down there, pharmaceutical industry stuff, customer relationship management. And so you can see that in the second column, these are kind of different terminology for very similar records. Policies, procedures, how-to manuals, etc. The next column gives you a kind of brief description about each to give more context for what they are. And then the column on the far right gives retention periods for each, which it does vary a bit per series, but all are within a 2 to 3 year range roughly of each other. So very similar retention periods. And then moving to the next one. Oh, and actually going back, and just wanted to mention that, we've kind of taken some legwork to get these all together so that they're easy to see and easy to understand. But keep in mind that when you're looking at these in your retention schedule, they're going to be spread all over the place in the different functions. And so this is simplifying it for the purpose of this example. One kind of help tip to get you here from your retention schedule is, I find that key term filtering helps a lot with this. If you've got your whole retention schedule open and you key term filter on something like policies, if you're key term filtering your granular schedule title on a key term like that, it can help you kind of identify these and help you get started moving from your current state into something like this that's simplified.
Yeah, so there's a heavy lift. So we want to make sure that people understand there's a heavy lift that occurred before we got to this, but we needed to simplify it somewhat so you could look at it in the time frame that we have here.
Absolutely.
And if I can throw in a plug for having a software tool in this space, this is something you can do within a software tool, and that is to search for common terms like that and see things in a consolidated view, pretty much like you see here, whereas that's really difficult to do in a spreadsheet. You can search for terms and go next to each example, but it's hard to get them in a consolidated view.
And manually pulling them together is a bit of a challenge too. So. All right, so let's take a look. So, all right, so we see several series here, just to summarize, several series across multiple functional areas that are basically the same types of materials. And so this is an opportunity for consolidation. We see, a sort of a mixed bag of the retention. Again, they're pretty close to one another here. It's 3 years at the biggest of the spread. Some of the language is a little bit different. Can you just, I know we're going to look in a moment, just as a prelude to that, we're going to look at consolidating or simplifying triggers, but can you talk just for 2 seconds here about the difference between these types of triggers?
Yeah, so, and this will come up in another example where we're kind of hit it home a little bit more, but policies, procedures usually have a superseded type trigger. And so for the ones that don't here, there's still things like there's that current year one for the talking points. Essentially, it's either going to get superseded or it's going to be something that essentially expires. And so when we look to consolidate and look at the consolidated version, we'll see that we've tried to use language. I mean, you have to be cognizant of the trigger and making sure that the trigger works for the records that you're dealing with. And so, yeah, we see multiple triggers here. In the consolidated version, we'll see something that is designed to account for all of those.
Okay. All right, so let's look what happens here. So you've taken all of those, and what was the number we were at? 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 different series that are consolidated into one. Do you want to walk us through that, Rick?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've collapsed them all into one category that covers the different variants. Essentially, we distilled all of the duplicative language with representative examples listed there on the second column there from the right. You can see that we landed on a superseded / retired +6 retention. It is a slight increase to some of the legacy categories, and it's always going to be a risk-based determination as to whether that type of an increase is acceptable. It's not always going to be acceptable in every category. We use this one because most clients are okay with that type of a increase for policies, procedures, and the simplification outweighs any risk of over retention for these. We'll discuss, a big thing that impacts this is privacy. Privacy kind of limits the way that we can increase or decrease potentially. And so we'll talk about that. We've got an example dedicated to that in a few slides.
And I know we're going to talk about, an example. These are relatively close to one another. And again, because of the nature of them, it allows that sort of a little bit of over retention for some of the records. But we are going to talk about some of the more extreme outliers in a few of our examples where you don't really want to let the tail wag the dog in those instances. You want to carve out maybe an exception, consolidate the ones that are closer to one another. But we'll get into that example in just a minute. So
absolutely. One more point, Anne.
Sure.
We've also gone with the consolidated function, which is a shared function in compliance, regulatory, risk management. And some people may be thinking, well, how do departments know which records are theirs? People are going to want to be able to pull up the retention schedule and tell these records are relevant to me. And the way that we deal with that, we don't have it shown here, but we will add another column where we tag the different departments that utilize that schedule so that people are able to pull up the schedule titles relevant to their department by using that tag.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So the next example we're looking at is we're calling this horizontal sprawl. And again, don't get hung up on that term. When we were discussing it, I flipped them mentally in my brain. So we're the first one was across similar records across different functions, and now we're looking within a function here and some kind of sprawl within that given function. So would one of you just walk us through this? Tell us what we're seeing.
Yeah, I can go ahead and walk us through this one, Anne. So horizontal function here, we have, I think, a really good example is oftentimes within financial accounting.
Also HR down here too, right?
Yeah, there's a couple sneaky ones in there too, but yeah, across financial accounting, looking at all the different processes, you oftentimes see very similar retention periods, similar event triggers even. A sub-process here for your financial accounting record series may also have kind of some unique event triggers associated with them. However, I think we often find that, for payment submitted, for example, payment received, these really can kind of be simplified and kind of rounded out to a calendar year or a flat retention period. So this is a kind of analysis that you can go through. This is supposed to be an example of horizontal going within one function. We have a couple sneaky ones that we pulled in here from HR, but that's just another example of not necessarily collapsing an entire, two entire functions together vertically, but, kind of pulling in things that are related to these higher level processes. So I think that when you get into some of these functions and you go through, the focus really should be on where are these more granular processes interrelated or similar, and where do they have similar retention periods? Those are the two, I think, main areas for focus when you're trying to determine record series that would be appropriate for combining.
Okay. So let's look at what happens once we consolidate these. Can you walk us through this?
Yes, so this is a big bucket retention period or record series, excuse me, for general accounting. So you'll see that we were able to kind of collapse all of these processes. The key being is that now instead of, here at the sub-function or the sub-process level, it was describing very much a very specific kind of more granular process. The key here is that we have consolidated it, and you have to make sure that our description is really all encompassing and at that higher level process for the description. You know, anytime that you're simplifying, combining record series, the details of the description are really what are going to help kind of define that record series for the end users. They can see these are the processes involved here. I understand what the outputs are. The examples are also important, you know, for records retention schedule. Of course, it's really not ideal to make it 100% inclusive and include all of the examples. That's just not very manageable, and it's unwieldy. But you know, combining those examples, removing duplicate examples across these functions so that this is really still also searchable. So hand in hand, having that really kind of comprehensive, robust record series description and the consolidation of the examples. The consolidated retention period now you'll see is simplified. It's a creation plus 7 years. We were able to determine that, you know, based on the life cycle of some of these records that had very specific event triggers, it really was feasible to kind of round it out to a flat retention period. And so here is our simplified record series for general accounting.
And you can see how these are different with this one, creation plus 7, payment, and then report submitted have all sort of been simplified. And again, we'll be looking at a simplified trigger period and discussing that specifically in a few more, couple examples from now, but you can see how that was consolidated here. So we're actually going to take a quick look at this, but before I do, so just in versatile retention, but I just want to make sure that people understand that you could keep some of this information so people could search on these functions, right? So they could look for the specific types of documents. So you're not, so, you know, people should not worry as much. If you do this right, you get the benefit of the simplification by consolidating these, you know, disparate record series, but can still, you know, maintain the findability of that information for people who are used to looking for that information using specific terms.
Yes.
So let's take a look. I'm going to hand this over to Warren. He's going to talk to us a little bit about what this looks like in versatile retention.
Yeah, and so what you're seeing here is just one screenshot from our software versatile retention where we have a function. It's just a toolbar button that says merge, and you're able to either merge multiple schedules into one new schedule like you're seeing here, or into an existing one. And the idea is that instead of having to, say in a spreadsheet, copy and paste multiple cells into one and kind of sift through things and you know, kind of do that manual process of moving things around, we try to just simplify that process, save you some clicks so that you can essentially say, well, this is the one I want, and I want to select some other ones to join in with that. And you can see that at the top of the columns there, we've got source schedule 1, and it says, you know, if there's a conflict with the things that we're merging, what do you want to do? So in one column, we've said, well, use these as the sort of the primary. In another case, we say, well, if there's a conflict, try to append the information. So if you have large descriptions or those examples fields, that just saves you from having to retype or to copy and paste. We just try to blend that together, and then you get the option to sort of edit that data in that final column on the right there where it says merge into that schedule. So saving some clicks, saving some copying and pasting, but also once you finalize that with the save button there, those two original schedules that are in the view, those will be set as inactive or deactivated so that you don't have to worry about those still existing. But you'll have those as a reference in your audit trail. You'll be able to still see them if you have the ability to see the inactive schedules. But it just really saves a lot of the time and the headache of that consolidation. So
is that view typically seen by, so the source schedule, is that viewable just by the admins or by end users? Can you adjust that?
You mean once it's consolidated? Yeah, once you have consolidated, then it's just a matter of who you've assigned permissions to that can view the inactive schedule. So with the permissions, you know, the role-based permissions, you can determine who gets to see those and who doesn't. And you also have just the ability to check a box on the main view to say whether you want to see the inactive schedules.
And of course, then here we see the examples. So people would be able to search on those. Is that correct?
Exactly. In fact, you know, one of the things that really makes a a big bucket schedule work is that ability to search across those different fields, those different examples. You know, as opposed to older times when you had to rely on the structure to find what you were looking for, now you can have a much more consolidated structure and be able to search for those terms throughout the schedule.
Just what does that conversation look like? So we've looked at the examples and the opportunities we see for consolidating, but when you're having that conversation about bucketing, does it, you know, when you're sort of doing the risk appetite analysis, what does that convo look like with the client?
That's probably more of a Rick or Jen question, but so I'll toss that one back to them.
Anybody?
Sorry, I'm embarrassed to say that I was answering questions.
Oh,
so I
terrible.
didn't actually hear
So
what Warren just tossed back.
that was just a question. It was a high level question, sort of how do you start that conversation? So we've looked at some of the examples and some of the considerations, but, you know, do you get, I'm just getting some sense of what I want to get a sense of, you know, do you get pushback from people? You know, what are the pushback points, those kinds of things?
Oh yeah, there's definitely pushback on consolidation, but I mean, that pushback is great because, you know, what I just typed actually in the chat is this whole process needs to be balanced and reasonable, and it can't result in over retention, and it can't result in you know, impacting people's operational needs for the records. And so the pushback usually helps you guide maybe deconsolidating some stuff where granularity is appropriate and reasonable. There are also some situations where, you know, maybe it's based on some misunderstandings of what the retention schedule is and how it operates, and how it's not a file plan. It's not something that's telling you where to keep your records. It's telling you for how long to retain your records. And so a little bit of education will sometimes also help with that pushback.
Just, I wanted to ask a quick question about this before we move on to the next example. There's the image we have on the screen here. We had talked, we were prepping for this, about the value of legacy mapping. And so I think we're seeing a little bit of that here. At least this is, you know, Warren, you were looking at this mostly from a consolidation perspective, you know, that it makes using the tool makes it easier from a you know, to see what you're consolidating. You can do it by a click of the mouse as opposed to cutting and pasting and so on. But there's also some advantage to this sort of legacy mapping and even the exercise of doing the legacy mapping.
Yeah, in fact, what we often see is that when you're creating the new consolidated schedule item, like what we have on the right-hand side there, we can have a field, maybe one of the user-defined fields that says, it might say something like legacy reference. So it might have the record code or record title of the items that were consolidated into this one, so that if someone searches on what was the old code, they come up with the new one and they can see that it was at some point consolidated.
Okay.
Another kind of stress test you can do with the new retention schedule is not give users that legacy mapping. So you're of course going to be doing that legacy mapping when you're consolidating. It's all going to be built into what you're doing. But if you then kind of socialize the new simplified retention schedule out and say, okay, as your guys' first task, align where you think your records go to this retention schedule, you'll know whether you did a good job of creating kind of intuitive categories of records that people understand, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of revise and clarify where people are misunderstanding where their records could go within the retention schedule.
So you would have everyone, so to stress test it, you would have everyone just match all of their records, their old series to the new series, and have them go through.
Or designated, you know, subject matter experts if you don't want to make everyone do it. You know, you've got maybe.
I don't think you get buy-in for everyone. I meant every sort of department having some.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whoever your project lead is with each department. Yep.
All right, let's move on to the next kind of example of sprawl here. This is, I think, Jen, you've touched on the term sub-processes here, but this is a specific one that's looking at those sub-processes. Can you walk us through this one?
Yeah, so here we've got different types of pollution monitoring, and they're all within the same function. Oftentimes they'll be within the same department if you're in a departmental schedule. So it's what we're terming horizontal sprawl again. So it's similar to the last one that Jen just described. However, the difference here is that we have an outlier to kind of demonstrate. While the air and water related monitoring categories have a similar retention period ranging from 5 to 7 years, the series highlighted in red has a permanent retention period.
Mhm.
So if that retention period is valid, which is a kind of a different subject matter and a different story, but if it's valid, to consolidate, we would need to over retain the air and water monitoring records significantly.
Mhm.
So I think this provides a good example where even though there are similar processes going on, it's all related to pollution and pollution monitoring broadly. Because hazardous substances requires a significantly longer retention, we don't recommend consolidating it with the other categories.
And here this one's permanent, so you'd basically be over retaining forever on all of these other.
Exactly.
So, all right, so let's look at what that looks like. And also, can you just talk a little bit about, so we'll get to the example of as we switch slides, just the language, and there's some art in crafting that language, right? So this one.
And so what we try to do, addressing your question, Anne, is we try to go broad with our description and our title. And the reason we do this, instead of being more precise, is because we want the retention schedule to be able to be evergreen and stay valid even when slight naming conventions and slight changes to processes happen. Now, this doesn't work for every industry because there are industries where the preference is to have exact, precise language. So this is kind of the example for the majority of our clients. And you can see with this one, it's broadly described in that description to cover monitoring for all types of pollution, day-to-day environmental impact resulting from company actions, that type of thing. And then we've termed it representative examples because we don't want to mislead or make the users think that every record that they've got will be listed there. We just want to give them context so that they can figure out where their records go.
Okay.
Now, there are specific industries that don't want that want every single one of their records listed. I think nuclear is a great example of that. I've worked with some nuclear clients to try to use representative examples, and almost every single one they've said, well, we actually want every single one of our records listed, and it's an exact process, and so it's understood that way. But yeah, looking at what we've got here, we see that all but the hazardous series has been consolidated into that top one. And then we've also added that guidance in red to point users out to the fact that even though it's related, this hazardous category has its own series. And so this type of guidepost is something that we often use to call out related series where series or processes interact or are related.
And that would go in the description in the tool if you're using it that way. You would,
or you have another category dedicated to related categories. Yep, another user-defined field or another column. Yep.
Okay. All right, let's take a look at the next example. This is we're returning now to simplification or elimination of triggers. So what do we see on this one? So we see some complexity. I can see that's until superseded, current +5. So I'm seeing differences in the retention period length, of course, but then also what the trigger would be as well. Which one of you wants to walk us through this one?
And so we're back to our policies, procedures, guidelines series for this example. And most of them, as we already discussed, have a superseded trigger, which is really common for this type of category. And to take a step back, we've been talking about this term trigger, but just to kind of explain it a little bit, it's an occurrence that must take place before the number of years or months specified starts to run. So in this example here, the 3 to 6 year retention periods would start to run once the policy, procedure, guideline is superseded, which would happen, as soon as a new version of that same document is published, replacing that old version. There was a question on that, and so I wanted to make sure to hit on it. So in working with clients, we found that most policies and procedures like this are superseded within a short span. Clients are updating their code of ethics, their IT policies, procedures, their employee manuals, for example, on usually an annual basis, if not sooner than that. And so this is the type of trigger where we evaluate it and we say, is it really necessary to keep that level of complexity of having a trigger in it? Or can we add a year, get rid of the trigger, and just have a fixed retention period, which is much easier to calculate for systems and really for people, because you're not having to worry about, documenting when the policy was superseded.
Mhm.
You've got a date of when the policy was created, and okay, I can set a date this many years off in the future, and this can be disposed of at that time. So especially for systems, getting rid of triggers is a major initiative in trying to simplify clients' retention schedules.
So this requires some initial investigation to see what they're like, how often they update these things. What do you do? I mean, sometimes certainly I've run into this issue where people say X is supposed to be updated every X period, and it doesn't always happen. So what about that kind of scenario?
You got to add a little buffer into it if you need to. If you're
Mhm.
not confident that it's going to be updated within that time period, you need to add an additional year maybe. And again, that's one of those things where you have to evaluate the risk of something not being superseded within a year with the risk of over retaining for an additional year, and pick the spot that you're most comfortable with, if you're even comfortable doing this type of exercise at all.
It's
for
also,
example,
I think, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, for example, using that air emissions example, back to that one that we just did, another one that you could group with that potentially would be the permits that go along with that process. The problem, though, is that those permits may last for a number of years, and they're different. They vary between 5 years, 3 years. Some of them are annual. And so that's one where you can't really get rid of that expiration trigger with those air permits to normalize at a fixed retention period. And so we're going to break those out and not consolidate it with those air emissions records.
And it's just, I think it's another just reminder that before you pull the trigger on the deletion, you actually have to have these things reviewed.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
All right, so what do we see here? So the consolidation here is now becomes creation plus 7 years.
Yep. And if any of these don't supersede within 1 year, this won't work, of course. That creation, we had another question touch on this. Creation is kind of the default retention period that is assumed if it's nothing is there. So that could just say 7 years, and most people would think of that as a creation plus 7 when the record is created plus 7 years.
Okay. All right. Anything
We've had
else?
lots of questions on those triggers. We might have to at the end kind of spend a little bit of time discussing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So here's another trigger example or simplification of the retention schedule that we're looking at here. So what do we see in this one?
Yeah, I can explain this. So here's an example of a pharmaceutical record series that relates to batch manufacturing for drug products. Now, this is, I think, a really great quintessential example. This might be a bigger bucket record series. It might relate to a lot of different types of drug products. All of them really can have different event triggers. It might be, for APIs, 5 years after the qualified person signs off, or there might be a drug expiration event trigger in there. There might be, this, as we have here, an example, distribution plus 3 years. Whichever is longer, and it might even get more convoluted if you're considering, devices, expected life of the device. So one approach is to see if you can determine a calculable retention period. And this isn't just for batch manufacturing records. I think there's a lot of different instances where you can potentially go from multiple relevant event triggers retention periods and see if you can't find something that is calculable, but also reasonable, understanding, of course, that, if we were to be adhering to, disposition precisely with the requirements, we would have to separate and create a separate series for every single product. And is that realistic? Is that manageable? So what we want to do is see what we can do. For some of our clients, it depends on what products are involved. Maybe a 5-year retention period really kind of covers all of these potential event triggers. And so if we can go to the next slide, we'll see what it kind of turns into. So here's a flat retention period. Now, is it always so simple to figure this out? You'd have to be able to know, what's potentially the shelf life involved for the drug. What is, if you're looking at devices, what is the actual expected life of the device? Plus, is there some additional time we want to consider in there for risk considerations, that relate to various liabilities for these products? So maybe it's longer. But nonetheless, kind of taking all of this together, rather than having, potentially a complicated hybrid retention period or many different record series that, makes the retention schedule become a little bit more unwieldy, you have a simplified retention period. And the feedback we get from clients is retention periods like this of a flat, calculable or calculated retention period is much easier to implement, across the organizations and in systems.
Okay. To add to that, Jen, what I see on the operational side when people are trying to implement these kinds of schedules is that the risk of over-retaining really ends up being compared to the risk of just never destroying it at all. So you might be concerned, oh, am I keeping this a year or two longer than I should? But most of the time, it just means it never gets destroyed because no one ever goes back to figure out what those event triggers are and actually apply them to the records.
That's absolutely true. That's a really good point, Warren.
Okay, now we've had a couple of questions, I think, that touch on privacy, but also we've touched a little bit on privacy considerations as well. So let's move to an example on that. So this is strategic privacy consolidation. I know historically we've dealt with this idea of minimum retention periods, but the privacy requirements are actually cutting in the opposite direction. So can you walk us through this one?
Yeah, yep, I can do that. So what we have here is several record series that are essentially coming from personnel related functions, human resources, and kind of all divided up into specific sub-processes, but you will see that we have event triggers here. They all relate to the duration of employment. So kind of looking at this, we see that all of these really relate to, employees that have been hired essentially, and we can kind of start to see that maybe there's opportunities here to consolidate. Now, I think one thing, obviously, the privacy question in the back of all of our minds is, what really, how aggressive can you go? You don't want to be unnecessarily over retaining personal information. Our clients across the spectrum, they're kind of managing privacy in different ways. And, whether or not this information that's being retained is being sanitized, for example, at a certain point in time, how is it being treated? These are all different kind of unique considerations, but I think that we can all agree that to whatever extent possible and reasonable, you would want to make sure that you're kind of separating out like processes that can be retained for a shorter period of time versus those that can be retained for a longer period of time.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look at what happens here. So these are ones that are open to consolidation. So
sure, yeah. And so what we see from our clients, and it's, this actually could just be its own presentation, maybe next time, but there's definitely kind of a legitimate basis for kind of keeping certain records for a certain period of time. There's differing opinions coming out from data protection authorities that relate to statutes of limitations, but what our clients are also looking at is what are the business and operational needs supporting this. And so, that's something to keep in mind when you understand what your, how you're handling the privacy information, what that risk profile is, where can I group records together and potentially lengthen, retention periods for some records in the name of, administrative ease and ensuring that these records are actually being, destroyed on a timely basis and not being over retained because people can't follow a very, very granular, complicated retention schedule on the other hand.
Now, here's our next privacy consideration. What do we see here, Jen?
Yeah, so these are kind of what we would consider kind of separate high risk, records. These are very much records that you'll see. We've got non-hires here. We've got biometric information. These are certainly, I think, very, very much regulated, increasingly domestically in the United States and, also European Union. You want to be very careful about how you consider potentially consolidate and really try to minimize the retention for these in line with what we call compelled privacy or the maximum privacy requirements are providing, and also no longer than what those legitimate kind of business needs for the business are. So these are, I would say, candidates for not combining and not increasing the retention period. It's an opportunity when you're doing the simplification to kind of re-examine these retention periods, refresh your research, see what these jurisdictions are saying, and try to tailor that retention period as short as possible.
Okay. So this is the consolidation. You've actually, it looks like you've reduced both buckets. So this group that these three that you are grouping, and then the last
Right.
one.
Yeah, so we see through our simplification, this was an opportunity. We've got non-hire records. This is a potential global retention period. We've got an example here from Utah that's putting a shorter retention period for these records, and have kind of tailored it to 2 years. Now, several international jurisdictions are going to say shorter. In an international schedule, you will look at much shorter retention periods in some instances. Biometric information, same thing. Right here, we have it tailored to a Texas requirement, biometric kind of compelled privacy or maximum retention requirement. But it's the same scenario as well. If you are looking at international jurisdictions, you will likely want to keep this much, shorter. And so even with a retention period as presented here, and making sure that you're complying with all of the requirements, you might even consider how low can I go with my baseline, and maybe even create exceptions for the US or certain US jurisdictions, and ensure that it's as low as possible for all of the jurisdictions.
Okay. All right. Now we need to pick up the pace a little. We have a ton of questions we want to get to, and a little bit more meat in this to get through. So we're going to look now at globalizing. Global records retention schedules. And I think Rick, you were going to lead us through this one. Can you just lead us through these? Tell me when to advance the slide, and because you want to point out a couple things on here.
Yeah, we can go quick here. We've got a lot of slides that mostly duplicate information here, but illustrate an approach that's commonly taken. Many organizations have country-specific retention schedules. Our experience is that most companies still have similar, if not identical, processes in different countries. So even though the naming conventions are different, usually the records are similar. A lot of times the retention periods are different, and so that's the thing that's really changing. And so as you scroll through these, and you can see, here's Bahrain, and it's got a creation +8 that's a little different than the rest. If you go to the next one, Canada has a creation +15 that's a little different for environmental monitoring. Denmark's got a creation +11 that's a little different for their accounting. And so we've kind of highlighted the ones that are different, and all of the other information is repeating. And so if we keep going through,
this one's an interesting one. Exposure +5 years
max. Yeah, so there's a privacy requirement that's impacting that one.
Fairly long one there. And then this one.
That 11-year one is typical of accounting records in Europe. So you'll see that repeated in all the European jurisdictions. And then, we've got a exposure requirement that's requiring duration of employment +30 for the US there.
So what's this?
So you can kind of see that here we have taken all the duplicate information and we've kept it on the far left, and we've created columns for each country so that you can see the differences for each country. It's a little better when you do it this way, because instead of completely repeating each schedule, you're only kind of repeating the retention periods for each country. So we took essentially 8 slides worth of information here, and we boiled it down into one slide that is admittedly still kind of complex. If we go to the next slide, it's even better. We've taken that complex slide, and yeah, this is what we'll term the best slide in Excel, at least. And we've created a default global baseline retention period, which is the retention period that was the most common between the jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have listed jurisdictional exceptions off to the right for each country where they're relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really just a duplication of information game
Mm-hmm.
with that. But I mean, getting rid of pages and pages worth of retention schedules, essentially.
So
And part of
potentially dozens of series potentially, right?
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
And part of the driver for that, I think, Rick, is that a lot of times there's a need to produce the schedule for a given country. And so without having a specific column or worksheet for that, it's necessarily complex to display that in a spreadsheet, usually involving multiple spreadsheets or multiple worksheets within a single spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
So Warren, would you walk us through this one also?
Sure. This is just taking one of those examples, that general accounting, and what you're seeing here is basically on the left-hand side, we're showing that that single retention schedule item, the single record category, and then on the right-hand side, showing you what the country exceptions look like. So it's sort of another way to display what Rick showed in that sort of best example from a spreadsheet point of view, but showing it as it would look in our software tool, where you have the various countries listed, and showing the retention periods that exist there. But there's actually even more going on than just the exceptions, because you'll notice too that it has a column there for which countries are included. So for this example, we're saying that everything in this list of countries is included with the exception of China. So maybe in this example, China doesn't keep those kinds of accounting records, and so you would know that that particular record category doesn't apply to China.
So now we're looking at it here. This view is allowing me to see it as where this record series applies and how it's handled in each of the countries. Can I produce a Brazil specific retention schedule if I want to?
Exactly, yes.
I'm in Brazil and I just want to see that view.
Yeah, so not shown on this screen is the ability to do a search by a specific country, and it would only show those record categories that have that included check mark, and it would show both the baseline, like in this case, the creation plus 7 years, plus the country-specific retention, so you'd be able to easily see those side by side and understand where those exceptions are.
Okay. All right. In the interest of time, let's move on to the next example. So this is another issue related to globalizing the retention schedule, but here we're looking at the language and sort of generalizing the language. Can you explain what's happening here?
Yeah, I can explain this. I think we can go through this actually just fairly quickly, but an example here, simplifying your retention schedule, making sure that it speaks to all end users, for a global retention schedule. So rather than including within the title anything that's jurisdictional specific, or the description that's jurisdictional specific, make sure that it really does speak to everybody globally. Lots of opportunities there. It's okay, I think, to have jurisdictional specific examples, but keep them out of the titles and the descriptions.
So we have genericized, instead of IRS, we have the tax authority to cover everybody. Okay. And here's another globalization example.
Yeah,
on the
here's
language.
another kind of jurisdiction specific. It's not all about the US here. So, making sure that now instead we've kind of transitioned this to be a very specific kind of jurisdictional specific immigration process that is now more encompassing and would relate really to any jurisdiction that would be using the schedule. Again, we still have retained, I-9 would be a very popular search term with some end users, so it's okay to keep that, but keep it out of the title and the description.
Okay. Trying to advance this, give me 1 second. So this is handling country exceptions. This is sort of that wag the dog issue that we were talking about earlier.
Yep, yeah. Here we've got a mostly globalized retention schedule that lists default retention period at 7 years for general accounting records and then lists several country exceptions. One final exercise we can take to globalize is to evaluate all the countries, evaluate the risk of over retention, and land on a strategic default retention period that limits over retention while also limiting the number of jurisdictional exceptions.
So what
And
went
so,
into the thought process here? So you're 1 year off for Croatia. Is it so? There's some rule of thumb that you use as the
well,
cutoff, or
here we've just normalized at the mode, you know, the most commonly occurring retention period.
Mhm.
And we're assuming that for Switzerland, over retention of 1 year is acceptable. We're not letting the tail wag the dog with Croatia, maybe because operations, you know, the operations aren't as heavy in that country, or it's kind of an
Mhm.
outlier jurisdiction essentially. But if Croatia were the main country where operations were occurring, maybe it would be the retention period and there would be no jurisdictional exception. So this is really situational based on, you know, where you have your headquarters, where you have most of your operations, you know, how much over retention you're comfortable having, all those things.
Okay. All right, what are we seeing in this example? And I think we have one more after this then.
Yeah, this is the other side to that same coin. The retention period seems high for fixed accounting records here, 21 years. It just seems a little weird. And come to find out, when you dig into the research, you find, oh, there's a legal requirement requiring Austria to have these records for life of asset plus 21 years.
Mhm.
Well, if all the other countries that you're in have a much lower retention period, like say 11 years, maybe best to break that one out so that the tail isn't wagging the dog for every other country,
Mhm.
and have a jurisdictional exception for Austria.
So here somebody already did a big bucket approach here and maybe oversimplified. So as you're
Absolutely.
doing, so that's another side to be mindful of as you're reviewing your schedule to see what has been done previously and whether that even makes sense. So, all right, let's move on to the last examples here. 11. So sub-jurisdiction considerations.
Yeah, so I can walk through this. You know, this isn't necessarily simplifying, but you know, something to think about when you're going through your retention schedule, when you're doing the simplification, when you're refreshing. And this is kind of an example along the lines of privacy. We don't want the tail wagging the dog in New York requirement, 18 years for claims and workers' comp submissions, claim forms. Does it make sense to have your global retention period 18 years for these records? I mean, this is sensitive personal information across all jurisdictions. So absolutely not. You know, see how you can normalize this. And it used to be not really, you know, acceptable to create an exception for a sub-jurisdiction, but in this instance, you know, maybe it should be. Maybe that's something to think about. So it's not really simplifying it, but it's an important consideration.
Okay. All right, I'm going to open it up now to questions. I don't know if you have seen, if any of the three of you have been watching the questions on the fly there and see some that you are keen to answer, but let's just work through some of these that I'm seeing.
There are a bunch.
Some of them are out of context now. So does the Zazio tool have the capability to output, publish approved results to the to an intranet, possibly even an internet in some cases where staff can reference?
Yeah, I can take that one since it's on the technical side. Part of the solution for our tool is having an end user view that is just a read-only view of the schedule that can be published internally or in the cloud for that matter. Makes it really nice for people who just need to go in and do those searches and references without having any issue as far as messing up the schedule. But yeah, it's part of the tool.
Okay, so there's another question here. Have you considered building in the ability to build a file plan into VR?
In some ways, yes, because we often use versatile retention in conjunction with our records management tools, which do have file plans. And so oftentimes we'll link the two together so that one flows into the other. And that way you've got sort of both the schedule view as well as what we would often call the series or the file plan view. So we definitely do handle that as well.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm zipping through these. So would you recommend identifying those records on the records retention schedule that are digitally born, even though the retention is the same regardless of the media type it's housed in? In addition, identify those records that are scanned into the department's EDMS on the record schedule. So it's just, I think it's a question about adding additional types of information about the records.
Yeah, we do recommend that. We've kind of shown just the basic components of the retention schedule here, but having other columns that list, what database the records are in, where they're physically located, their security level, their personal information sensitivity, those types of things are all things that either exist for almost all clients on a background retention schedule, along with kind of the regulatory stuff like the citations considered and the driving citations and the operational needs. Some of those things get published to users, like location or something like that. But
Okay.
whether they want them to be hidden or just for the people managing the schedule is kind of a question that some clients, decide.
Okay, I think we can dispose of this one pretty quickly. I do not see the citations linked in the examples. If including those would just add another column. So those citations would be included in the tool. I think just it was an issue here of space. So
absolutely, very important component.
Why are there no examples of the hazardous materials in the permanent retention? I think, again, that's just because it was an example. You certainly could have those. Anything to add on that one?
Yep. And you can list out individual chemicals. You can list out the different records associated with it. Absolutely.
Okay. Is there a separate view to set up the retention schedule for the IG team and then another view for users once completed? Or is this meant to be a shared experience as the schedule is developed and for ongoing changes in real time or all? Maybe that's that might be a Warren question.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that idea of the fact that like in our tool, we have the administrator view, which has more features and functions and robust capabilities. And then we have the end user view, which is more geared towards just searching and finding things and reporting. And it's read only so that you are just kind of boiling it down to the basic needs of the end user.
Okay. This one I don't know if we can answer without more information. Our organization operates under 2 retention schedules. When attempting to create a big bucket schedule, the triggers can vary widely from 1 to 20 years, say for admin records. How can you deal with this issue without keeping the records too long as a default? I'm unclear as to how that's working and why.
Yeah, I would expect to see different jurisdictional requirements driving those longer retention periods, and you deal with those with jurisdictional exceptions like we had already discussed. If retention periods are vastly different for similar records for 2 businesses within the same jurisdiction, I think there's probably some operational needs at play that need to be kind of flushed out and figured out, because legally they would all be set at a similar period. So if operationally they're different, I would ask the question why and try to figure out how to get the inflated ones down potentially.
So this is just another one related to the view. I think it's where are the citations located and how do you consolidate and keep them tied to the actual document? So this is I think one of the advantages of doing this in a software platform as opposed to just doing it in an Excel spreadsheet. You can update those things live. So it's just another part of the view. We didn't have it visible in the examples just because we needed some space to blow up the examples so people could actually read them. Is that fair, Warren?
It is, yeah. It would be another tab like the countries tab. It's a listing of the citations. But one of the advantages too with the tools, you can have one instance of the citations and multiple links to those, whereas in the spreadsheet, you're really copying and pasting the same reference over and over again to different different schedule categories.
Okay, we are at 3 o'clock. I'm going to just see if we can blow through a couple more a couple questions here, but I think we're definitely going to have to do a follow-up if you guys are game for it. Are there other best practices for executing on the retention schedule besides generalizing, simplifying retention periods when you have many event-driven triggers? Auditors in regulated industries don't always allow for the retention period of regulated records to be simplified.
Yeah, I think we described several different ways to simplify, whether it be consolidating like items or globalizing. You know, those are just a few examples. But if auditors are rejecting, you know, trigger simplification, that's probably an indication that it's best not to simplify that that specific trigger, or maybe a discussion about how the trigger simplification is helping operationalize the disposition, which isn't occurring with the complex trigger, might, you know, help with that.
And if you can modify the technical process to where you can get a feed of actual event trigger dates into the system that manages retention, then you can actually utilize those actual things, whether it's, you know, the end of a contract or closing of a case, if that can be fed into your retention system so that you can actually calculate those retention dates when they occur, then you can still utilize the specific ones that the auditors want without compromising your retention schedule.
So, how often do you see organizations keeping records longer than the legal minimums based on business need?
All the time.
I would absolutely say that's pretty common, actually. You know, it's not uncommon to see that business operational needs will drive the retention period and the legal requirements will be shorter. So that is the case for, you know, a lot of different types of record series that we see.
Yeah, they set the minimum, and the lawmakers aren't really in tune to what the operational needs are when they're doing it. They've got a different agenda when they're setting those laws. But I mean, the most important reason to keep the records is for your operations and your operational need. And so if it extends past and it's reasonable, absolutely. Although privacy can drive it back down to that longest.
Okay. How about this one? Do you ever assign a number of years to permanent, such as 99 or 100, at least to set the scene for a review? Numbers can be needed in content systems. So this is just sort of working around a forced number entry. Do you see that?
Yeah, we usually see that when the system just has a limitation where it requires a number versus the ability to say that it's permanent. So it really is just system dependent.
And do you put in a default like that, like 99 years or something?
We see that a lot. We'll usually convert that to the permanent category when we convert it over to our system, but yeah, we see that a lot.
Okay. All right. I'm going to wrap it there because we're already a couple minutes over. So I think we will do a follow-up if the Zasio team is game to do that. There are a bunch of unanswered questions here. Sorry. I think that's a good sign. There's a lot of interest in this. So we will see about recording some responses to those. I want to thank all of our panelists for today's webinar and thank them for continuing to serve this community by sharing their knowledge. ARMA's next webinar will be announced very soon, so keep an eye on your email inbox. Before we close, I'd like to just to remind you to become a professional member of ARMA International. Take time to invest in yourself. ARMA has an array of resources available for you, including white papers, training, articles in our magazine, webinars like this, and much, much more. On behalf of our speakers, the wonderful folks at Zasio, who give of their time and money to support to sponsor programming like this, and ARMA International, I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar and wish you the best in all your information endeavors. Stay safe and stay well. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.